So I've just been watching a few different people's takes on the whole coronavirus thing, and particularly the American ones are the most frustrating. But obviously, I'm looking at it from the outside, like, um, yeah, I would be really worried if I was living in the US. Not, um, yeah, no, okay, that's not right. Uh, like, so people are trying to, I guess, people are trying to conceptualize what's going on and how it's bad and what part of it's bad and what is whose fault. And I think that uh, one of the things that's limiting to most of the analysis of Americans is that they're just looking inside America at like what America is doing or things that are happening in their community as a way of gauging, how the entire world is responding. And yeah, like the American situation is very specific, and so that kind of to me indicates that um, there's not it's not a conspiracy, because if it was like, in some way, if there was this kind of collective, bill, like individual billionaires are always trying to scam to do fucked up shit, like and they'll scam in this situation, and they'll scam on a plane, and they'll scam in a lane. um but it's not like yeah, all connected in that sense. um One of the so just to establish, like, my understanding of it is that the virus is not deadly in the sense that it kills individual people, but it's deadly in the sense that it's highly or it's much more contagious than regular flu, and you can have it for a much longer time and spread it to other people, where like it's like 14 days as opposed to 3 or 4 with the regular flu. um so it's not, yeah, it's not so much the virus itself that's deadly, but what's deadly is having a whole bunch of people infected all at once and not being able to have enough medical supplies to help everybody through it. Um, yeah, uh, and like, yeah, watching someone struggle to breathe is like, that's a really fucking torturous thing to have to survive. Um, so yeah, it's not so much the virus that's deadly; um, it's the society. And so John Pilger is a very well respected journalist in Australia. Has always been really staunch in calling out like government, like a lot of stuff around Aboriginal Australia. He's done a lot of good journalism on, and he now sort of works for, or does a lot of work with, Russia Today. So that gives you an indication of how outside the mainstream, or like, he's not going to get corporate funding for what he does, but he is still, regardless, like, um, I think, yeah, much more respected in Australia amongst conservatives than you would imagine this a comparable thing happening in America. Um, so he did a report into, or did, was saying on Russia Today that the NHS had done some kind of testing or like self review about 3 years ago into how they would deal in the case of a pandemic, and it came out that they were not going to be able to handle it whatsoever, that all these systems failed and they just got flooded. There wasn't enough kind of capacity in the system, and they just ignored it. And I think because it's like lifeboats on the Titanic, they don't want to have like rows and rows of lifeboats hanging off on the side, because that's not profitable, that's not glorious. Yeah, and that's what's happening in the US. You have this giant Titanic of a society that has no public health system except for like for elderly people, I think. So yeah, that was like, you were bound to hit an iceberg eventually. And yeah, to survive a pandemic, you need stockpiles, you need excess capacity. Like one of the big things in the NHS thing was how many hundreds of thousands of beds did they have available at any one time for like something big to happen. And it's like, you would never have that in America, because to have an empty bed just waiting for a pandemic is a drain on any kind of privatized system. The privatized system is specifically designed to make sure there won't be idle beds just sitting around. That's what it means to have like the invisible hand of the market decide everything. You actually need central planning to some extent if you like actually want a society. And so now, like, it's like more people have died of coronavirus than died in the Vietnam War. More Americans have died of coronavirus than Americans died in the Vietnam War right now. And that happened in, like, the Vietnam War was longer than a few months from what I remember. So the virus has been reasonably deadly. There were mass graves being dug by prisoners in New York. So, presumably, those are people. So yeah, like it's a deadly, situation, but Americans can only think like Americans. So like in Australia, for example, a much different situation. We're basically like Canada, but if Canada was an island. We were like South Australia, which is one of the states of Australia, has had no new cases for ages. Every other state has like a few here. Even our like out of control situations are like 14 people died. So like they're talking on the news now, like they're going to just reopen like Australia internally, and there just won't be international flights. So I guess what I want to say is like what they did here was they doubled, like talked about before how shitty the welfare system here has been allowed to become. It's still miles better than the US, but they recently, when the virus hit, they doubled all the welfare payments, and they instituted, like they've done similar stuff in the US, but it seems like nowhere near to the extent in its like universality, and we've got a public health system. So yeah, that puts the whole thing in just a different light. So like if there are, like what's happening in one country isn't what's happening in every country. So this idea of like, I don't know, that there's one big new world ordery kind of like conspiracy about this, that's like being carried out like meticulously. It doesn't look like that if you look globally. Oh, also all the people who are like herd immunity. I'm pretty sure, didn't they do that in Switzerland? Like there are countries that have gone in, like tried different directions, and they were we're Nordic and we're all about white people's ultimate idea of freedom, which is to never be hassled by a police officer. And so it was kind of culturally weird in some ways for them to, as it was for everyone, but they made a big deal about it, and they didn't have any lockdown, and yeah, I think they're quickly running in the opposite direction I should look that up though. Someone called that out if that's wrong. Um, yeah, so I think like yeah, statistically, like there's so there's so many Americans. There's not really a, you know, you're still chances still are like terrorism and all the things you see in the news. The odds of you dying from it personally are probably not that great, but um, so yeah, I don't think it's like cause for panic, but yeah, the push needs to be for like collective solutions. Um, yeah, to just be like, I want to get outdoors so I can go back to work. Um, like that makes sense in a situation where there's no society, where no one like where you're just gonna die if you don't go back to work. Um, but when you are going to die if you do go back to work as well, that's when it's kind of like, well, maybe we need to create a situation where we can all take some time off for a little bit and it's not going to kill everyone. Um, yeah. Anyway, I've just been thinking about that stuff. Um, and I haven't got a video up. I've got a script that I'm sort of working on that's molding some ideas together, so there might be something a little bit more concrete later on.